Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Total War Warhammer 2. So I wanted to play this game enough to familiarize myself pretty well with the High Elves before I made this video, because they're the faction that I play, and I wanted to be able to sort of do that justice. So we're going to be going for a brief overview of the High Elf roster sort of as a whole here, and we're going to be going through some of their units in particular. But let's jump straight into this. We're not going into too much detail about each of these. So first of all, we've got ourselves the Princess. This is a little bit like the Wood Elf Glade Lord. Has got a mix of both melee and shooting capabilities, and is a little bit more durable in melee combat. Can be made into an absolute melee monster thanks to the Star Dragon, but the princess is a little bit squishier thanks to a lower armor and melee defense bonus there. So this is what you would use if you want to go for something that is very focused around missile combat, thanks to primarily the loose skill there. Items as well are a little bit more shooting orientated than the other options, but it's still kind of actually decent at melee combat. So it's a fairly good all-arounder if you want to select something. The only problem again being that sort of squishiness. Got the Prince as the other option. This is your bog standard melee lord, typical sort of melee skills there, and sort of typical sword, and a fairly important item that we'll get into in a separate video. Tyrion, he's your melee legendary. He's not very good. The only reason that I don't think he's particularly good is that he lacks any sort of armor-piercing damage on his main weapon there. I mean, he does have some, but it's not his. He's not an armor-piercing type of general, which is really important if you want to be going for general sniping or something like that, because most often high-priority targets have got lots of armor. He is very defensive, able to survive through a lot, which can be important against certain combinations. The high armor value, the high melee defense makes it so that he's not likely to go down to anything in particular except for high tier halberd units and certain monster types. But he is going to have a real hard time against certain generals and against certain types of units just because he lacks any sort of... he doesn't have the armor-piercing trait. Malhander is this horse that lets him sort of catch up and keep up to units very, very effectively. It is very, very fast, but he is stuck to sort of ground floor there. His items are kind of okay, one of them being regeneration and one of them being a sort of breath weapon type attack there. Teclis, he actually succeeds at being a fairly good arch wizard archetype. Can make him a little bit more durable with just the horse, but again, nothing more fancy than that available, unfortunately. He's got a bunch of different lore attributes, which makes him a little bit more versatile in terms of when he's casting spells, he gets all of those sort of bonuses there. Greater Arcane Conduit gives him access to a good amount of extra power recharge and increases that power pool. Potion of Koroi, a bit of sort of regeneration. This keeps him alive, and all of these things sort of work together to make him feel like he's capable of just casting spells and accomplishing something a lot more often. Because with a lot of wizards, you feel like they're not really doing too much over the course of most of the battle if they can't also wade into combat. Spells, he kind of has an interesting mix of different ones, one from each of these different lores here. Net of Ammontok, Chain Lightning, Flaming Sword of Ruin, the Enfeebling Foe, the Lock of Doom, and Regrowth. So, depending on what you're sort of going for your overall strategy, any of these could potentially be useful for you. Even Regrowth in the High Elf roster could potentially be useful if you really plan on doing something like bringing in a Star Dragon and just need that in the fight there. His items are completely garbage, and I would sort of avoid using them, generally speaking. For heroes, the High Elves have access to the Noble, and this guy's actually really interesting. He's got both armor piercing, and he's got bonus versus large, and this makes him sort of the opposite of Tyrion in that he's got lower statistics by quite a bit, but he's got these useful attributes that let him sort of either general hunt or monster snipe, and they're very, very useful for that role, and this is a good role for them to have, because the High Elf roster doesn't actually have very many units that are dedicated to that are able to keep up with mounted units or monsters like that. You can take the Barded Ithamar Steed, and they'll still maintain those traits, but if you put them on the Eagle, they lose them, so if you're doing this so that you can hunt down monsters or something like that, you'll want to keep him on the horse. For the Chariot, he also loses the anti-large, but he still has good armor-piercing damage, so you could potentially go for this. It's just, for a different sort of niche. The problem is that this is much more expensive than a unit of of Ithamar Chariots at 1,100 for the 3, and they do better impact damage than he does, so I would argue that the unit is better for the price. Next up, you've got 3 different types of mages. You've got the High Mage. We'll be going over High Magic in its own sort of video there. Mage with the Lore of Life there, Mage with the Lore of Light. Now, these guys don't have Arcane Conduit. Instead, they rely on the Starwood Staff and the Book of Hoeth. You can sort of separate each of the components into its different element there. The Starwood Staff is really good because it does a big amount of increase to the power reserves, which is what lets you keep casting spells. If you don't have any power reserves, you stop casting, basically. And the fact that these guys can do this an unlimited number of times, as long as the battle goes on long enough, means that you're going to always be able to do something with your magic. These guys have access to the Elven Steed, the standard one, non-barded. It's pretty decent, adds a lot of speed to these guys, letting them get out of combat really effectively. But I actually like the Ithilmur Chariot because this makes them into a really decent battering ram that just sort of goes around the back of enemy units and sort of smacks into them. They're extremely durable with 60 armor and a really decent amount of health for a mage, so I find that this is actually really quite effective for high elves to take. I've been sort of running around with that. One of the things that is important about the Ithilmur Chariot compared to some of the other chariots is that these guys have a 78 movement speed, which is enough to get away from a lot of enemy units that other chariots cannot, like the Razor Gore Chariot, which I found was way too slow for a mage to be on. And the Cold One Chariot, which goes rampaging and stops running away from spears and instead just stands in the middle of them and fights. So definitely one of the better chariots if you're going to go for a chariot mount on a character. Lore Master of Hoth is the last type of character there, and these guys are, technically speaking, a wizard, but they're actually more than that, a melee combatant. They have the same sort of stats as the nobles. These guys are stuck on foot, and they specialize at defeating other foot infantry. Very decent bonus versus armor, and an okay bonus versus infantry as well. Allows them to sort of chop their way through enemy elite infantry quite effectively. Their statistics are quite good. They're fairly durable as well, so these guys can be used as a sort of line breaker against heavily armored elite enemy infantry. For spells, they don't have any of the lore attributes, which hurts them a little bit, and both of their abilities are quite weak there, evasion being quite mediocre, and Foe Seeker being just sort of as it always is. For spells, though, you've got Shem's Burning Gaze. If you need a magic missile for one reason or another, and there are certainly times where I found that a magic missile would be useful, you can go ahead and take this one if you're not using one of the other wizards. Harmonic Convergence is something that I don't particularly like, though. It's a fairly cheap spell, but the fact that it's a single unit buff with relatively mediocre statistics makes it sort of not my favorite. It is nice that it is both melee attack and defense, though, because that sort of makes sure that you're going to be using those statistics. Spirit Leech. You can use this guy as a character assassin if you just take this Spirit Leech and get rid of all the other spells. Can be quite useful for that purpose. Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, if you want to sort of use this guy to lock down enemy cavalry or something like that, or other important units that you want to leave out of the fight or whatever, then this can be a good use for that. I find that it's just generally a good spell. We got Wissen's Wild Form here. Plus 25% weapon damage and plus 30 armor. Again, single target buff. It's a pretty solid buff in terms of the numbers that it gives you. Can be useful situationally, it's very cheap, but again, it's not my favorite since it's a single target. And then you got Earthblood, which I think is actually one of the better options for this guy. Overcasting this is a decent amount of health, and the high elves benefit from maintaining high health, because so long as you're able to keep over 50% health, you have a decent amount of bonus there. So now that we've gone over the characters, let's take a look at one of the core attributes of the high elves there. It's Martial Prowess. This is a constant ability for virtually every high elf unit out there. As long as their hit points are above 50%, they get plus 12 melee defense and plus 2 to melee attack. And this applies to every single high elf unit out there, except for the ones that have Martial Mastery, which is a bigger version of the same thing, and to the monsters. So it's a very powerful effect that lets their units stick into combat so long as they're healthy, but once they do start crumbling, they crumble really, really fast. It's what makes the Spearmen actually a fairly solid unit, to segue into the infantry here. It does mean that their melee defense is 50, which is very, very good. For range defense, they've actually got silver block chance of 55%, so they're able to avoid taking damage from a lot of different things in the early stages of a fight quite effectively. Their melee attack, though, leaves a little bit to be desired, and they're very expensive at 500 for a spear unit, which is pretty high for what they are. The problem with this is that the high elves don't really have any sort of mainline infantry for dealing with other infantry. They've got elites that are very good at it, and all of their elites are quite okay at this role, but they've got nothing that can sort of stand in a line and just beat up the enemy troops. If we take a look at some of the other factions here, take a look at the Dark Elves, they've actually got a bunch of different options for that purpose here. They've got the Bleak Swords, which are very, very solid sword infantry. They've got much, much less melee defense, but that's okay. They've got way more melee attack. Their weapon strength is a little bit better. They're cheaper. So these guys can be used as a front line just to fight against other infantry more cost effectively. Then you've got the Black Art Corsairs, and while they're more expensive, they fulfill the same sort of role. They're very, very solid. If you're against other infantry, typically speaking, armor is an extremely good stat to have, and these guys have quite a lot of it. And these guys then also have got bonus versus infantry and good weapon damage, piled on top of like a good melee attack and admittedly pretty bad melee defense. So the Dark Elves can sort of frontline with fairly powerful infantry if they're up against a lot of other infantry. For Lizardmen, you're looking at the Saurus Warriors there, and while they're very expensive, these guys are some of the toughest in the game. If you're looking for really cheap stuff, you can always just go ahead and take the Skink Cohort. The skink cohort's 300 points, but they've got a ton of hit points there for a 300 point unit. And their statistics are not necessarily all that poor for what they cost there. So you can definitely gum a unit up, deal some good damage with these guys. But yeah, like every faction basically has these sort of sword infantry that are just cost effective. I wouldn't say actually the Skaven Slaves are, but Clan Rats kind of are pretty cost effective all in all, thanks to strength in numbers, boosting up their numbers quite a bit here. So Clan Rats, you know, Saurus Warriors and Bleak Swords all sort of are a niche that Hiles just don't have at all. Instead relying entirely on the Spearmen. So this is why the Spearmen are quite good for what they are. They will beat most other Spearmen for cost, but the fact that they can't sort of hold the line against other infantry with swords is what sort of hampers them. They have got, instead, really, really good elite infantry. The White Lions of Krace are sort of borderline. You could potentially mainline them, and I have seen people using them as their main line there. Very decent amounts of armor and attack damage and defense, ultimately, for a greatsword unit. Lets these guys sort of chew through enemy units quite effectively, but they're still pretty expensive at 800 points. There are plenty of times where I found that these guys make a decent sort of first-line infantry, but it does mean that your lines are going to be quite small. By contrast, you move up to the Swordmasters of Hoeth, and this is where you start to see the way that the Hyles play the game. The way the Hyles, in my opinion, play the game is they've got sort of subpar holding units and support units. Swordmasters alone cannot win you a game necessarily, but if their flanks are being guarded for long enough by the Spearmen, who have that high defense value and are pretty durable against both missile fire and melee fire, if you've got lots of arrows sort of taking out high priority targets like Rat Ogres or Hell Pit Abominations, if you're doing that sort of stuff, then the Swordmasters can clean up the rest, basically. They'll be able to sort of chew through an endless number of units really, really effectively. And so long as the rest of your line isn't dying, these guys are going to be able to do all the killing. So they kill one unit, and the rest of your army's holding them off with spears. They turn and kill another unit, and the rest of your army's still trying to hold off with spears. They kill another unit, and the rest of your army's still trying to hold off with spears. And that's sort of how the Hylos play. Unlike other factions where you have to have your main core line actually stand pretty firm and actually get some kills and actually do well in combat because your elites can only kill so many, the Hyle elites, if given enough time to fight units one at a time, if like the Swordmasters are the ultimate 1v1 me bro kind of unit, if they're able to attack enemy units one at a time and then one at a time and then one at a time, they're going to go through like 10 different units all by themselves, and they're going to do an amazing job of carving through them. I've seen these guys come out of fights with 400 kills and half health under their belts there, so they're that strong. But the thing about them is they're very expensive, and if they get isolated, they can be destroyed. The Phoenix Guard are sort of the other type of that. Instead of being able to kill every enemy unit there, these guys will never die. I've had a unit of Phoenix Guard fighting off 2 units of Hargoneth Executioners, a unit of Blackguard of Naggarond, and they didn't win the combat per se. The enemy broke because of army losses, but my Phoenix Guard basically held those 3 units of elite Dark Elf infantry off for long enough for the rest of my army to win the battle. And the rest of my army also consisted of some pretty heavy hitters. So, like, these guys are the ultimate wall in the game there. They're also able to deal a lot of damage and cause a lot of kills, but, like, that's not really their role. The role is that these guys will anchor your fight in a way that allows you to sort of do hammer and anvil strikes or to pick apart the enemy with missile fire, and there's nothing that the enemy can do to sort of steamroll over these guys fast enough to get at your missile troops in time to really affect the battle. So, like, this is sort of the way the Hyles play. They rely on their elite units a lot more than other factions. Now, you can go for missile infantry with these guys. Their missiles are actually quite effective. Very, very cheap archer for what they are, 180 range, decent amount of ammunition and damage. These guys are able to just sort of fire off a lot of shots quite quickly at long, long range and deal a lot of damage in that sense. They are very, very fragile, and they're dedicated archers, to be sure. The archers with light armor are a little bit more durable just because of that extra armor and melee defense, but I wouldn't rely on these guys to stand up in melee combat. That's not what they're for. Instead, you get to the Lothran Sea Guard. Now, these guys are quite expensive at 650, but their stats are a little bit better than the standard spearmen in some respects there. But they do cost so much more that if you're trying to use a replacement for Spearmen, I would not recommend the Lothran Sea Guard. They also have a lot less hit points because they're a smaller unit size, so you do have to watch out for that. Now, these guys, with their missile attack, they're a little bit lower range, but they're still able to dish out the same amount of missile damage, and they're able to protect themselves quite effectively with their decent melee statistics, and in particular, their bonus versus large, letting them sort of fend off light cavalry and even heavier cavalry that try to come around the back lines and sort of crash into them. They've also got the variant with shields here, and these guys are just more melee defense. In fact, they've got more melee defense than the standard spearmen, and they've also got more weapon damage, and they've got excellent missile block chance. So if you get into a skirmishing fight, Lothran Seaguard are actually quite good at this because they've got that high missile block chance and then that decent damage all around there. So this is sort of what the Hyles have for their core here. Cavalry is when you start to get to again, that same sort of premise there. Valyrian Reavers, I found, are useful against Skaven and in some other situations there. The reason that these guys are useful against them is that these guys hit hard enough that it feels like heavy cavalry to a lot of the weaker Skaven units. Like, if you've got Skaven slaves with spears, these guys can just bowl into the front of them and they'll win the fight. Because Skaven slaves with spears are that weak. That doesn't work against really anything else. Like, even Skink Cohort will bog these guys down and still survive the fight. You could do cycle charging with these guys, but it's generally not worth the micro. Rear charging against Skaven as well with these guys, though, even if they've got something like the elite units, like Storm Vermin, I found that hammer charges with the Illyrian Reavers is disproportionately effective just because of how good they are at that sort of charge bonus. The problem is that 600 point price tag. You can get the same charge bonus and similar stat line out of the Dark Riders for 450 points, so these guys just cost a little bit too much to be effective in a lot of other situations. The only reason is that, like, these guys are all you really need against really light units. Next up, you got the Silverhelms. I've been finding that these guys are more and more disappointing whenever I take them. They're not necessarily too sturdy, and their charge bonuses and everything like that are not necessarily all that great. They can be used as sort of a line breaker against light infantry and stuff like that, and then deal a decent amount of damage, but they do trade poorly against other cavalry, I found. They are pretty fast, though, and they can be used for hammer and anvil strikes on discount, especially if you're up against something like Lizardmen, where you don't think Illyrian Reavers are going to quite cut it, because Illyrian Reavers really won't cut it. Silverhelms with shields, they cost 100 points more, and they're pretty much similar stats-wise. You would only really use these guys if you wanted to hunt down enemy archers or something like that, and knew for a fact that you were going to get shot at, and you wanted to block some of those bullets there. Other than that, though, you would probably want to use the Illyrian Reavers instead of that for that particular role. Ithilmar Chariots, I don't like Chariots. You guys know that I'm biased against these. Pretty decent stat line all around, very, very durable. Doesn't have anti-armor, though, which makes them a little bit weaker. I generally just take mages with chariots and have them rolling around the battlefield, since that is a little bit more cost-efficient to me, since I'm going to be buying those mages anyhow. Lastly, though, you've got the Dragon Princes of Caledor. These guys are, to the Hyles, like the cavalry equivalent to, like, the Sword Masters. There are certain cavalry matchups that these guys struggle a little bit against, but nothing that is going to go tremendously against them. Their charge bonus is absolutely gigantic, and they deal huge amounts of damage. They've got really good physical resistance and fire resistance, meaning that there's less options to try and take these guys out, and their statistics are higher than they seem thanks to martial mastery. Dragon Princes, if you take these guys, can hammer and anvil their way into a victory by themselves, essentially, so long as the rest of the line is able to tie the enemy up for long enough. And so this is the same sort of thing as with the Swordmasters of Hoeth and the Phoenix Guard. If you've got a line of spearmen who are able to defend and able to hold their position for long enough, the Dragon Princes will be able to kill everything in turn. They'll be able to come in, do a rear charge, and annihilate a unit so thoroughly that the rest of your army can then sort of breathe a bit easier, fill in the gaps in your center line. Then your Dragon Princes can cycle around, do another charge into another unit, and break that one right away too. And this is just how the Hives work. Everything is there to support your elites. Which I think is a very unique sort of playstyle, since no other faction quite relies this heavily on their elites, or has ones that are quite this powerful, but they do need that support from the rest of your army there. Illyrian Reavers with bows there. These guys don't do enough damage with their shots to make them too worthwhile, in my opinion. They cost 750 points, which is way too much for what they do. If you really need the light cavalry, I think that the Illyrian Reavers are a better deal there. And like, these guys miss out on that good charge bonus for a large extent there, and their missile damage is just never going to bring back the points value. So, generally speaking, the only time these guys are worth it is when you can fire off all your shots, not get shot to ribbons, and then still have time to charge against enemy infantry. Tyrnok Chariots, I have not found a great use for these guys yet. Their missile attack is actually pretty decent. This is not actually per shot there. They fire really rapidly. But each missile does fairly mediocre damage. It does do magic damage for some reason, and they've got decent sort of ability to charge through units, but they're fairly squishy. So I'm not entirely sure what I would use these guys for. They're decent enough at, I think, what they do as far as chariots go, but I definitely don't really favor them. Next up, we got the Great Eagle here. Great Eagles are too squishy for their cost point, and even if they get into an archer unit, I find that they rarely do enough damage to kill it off, and these guys cost a lot more than pretty much any ranged unit that's going to lose to a Great Eagle. And there's certain ranged units in this game now that will actually beat a Great Eagle, like the Lothran Sea Guard. For artillery, you've got the Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. This is actually a really nice siege weapon. The single shot I find is actually really bad, despite the fact that it theoretically does 200 damage per shot against large targets. A lot of them just survive through the 200 damage hits without really even caring, and it misses quite often when it's firing those single shots anyway. I found what's actually really good though is the multi-shot round. This does 20 damage per hit and fires 16 shots per volley against infantry, and it does sort of have a little bit of a slash effect, I find, or it looks like it does, where it's able to hit multiple infantry per shot. So you don't actually cause very many kills with this artillery piece here. What happens is you sort of fire it into the enemy, and it sort of bombards the unit, and a whole bunch of their units get thrown around, disrupted, and it slows them their advance, allowing you to fire even more and longer into that unit. And then it also eventually starts racking up enough damage that everyone just sort of starts dying all at once. It's actually a really, really powerful effect. I find it to be one of the better sort of anti-infantry siege weapons in the game currently. It is fairly inexpensive as well, which makes it even more appealing for that purpose. The only problem is that it is not a monster hunter and its range is a little bit poor, meaning that if you're up against other artillery, you could get counter-sniped with it. For rares, you've got the Flamespire Phoenix. This is an interesting option. I find it has some of the same flaws as the Eagle. It just is a bit squishy. It does have a little bit more durability thanks to its 12% damage resistance, the fact that it's resistant to fire, and the fact that it can regenerate its hit points. If it gets too low, it could potentially come back basically to life there. The problem with this is that it's 50-50, and I think you are paying for it assuming that it'll work. Its statistics in melee combat are quite decent, though, with an armor-piercing attack, which I always find to be a very, very strong thing. Wake of Fire allows it to sort of bombard units a little bit like a gyrocopter, which can be useful, but since you're only firing it from one of them, 10 shots is probably not enough for it to get its points back, but then you can charge into melee and it will be a lot more effective than a gyrocopter. So, an interesting unit, but I haven't really found any great uses for it yet. The stronger option, I would say, is the Frostheart Phoenix. This guy's actually really durable. Even its stats belie the fact that it's a lot more durable than it looks like. Good armor-piercing attack, very good damage sort of thing there. Good speed, good leadership, good armor, good hit points, good melee defense, and it's also got that 12% damage resistance there. What's nice is that this guy has a Blizzard Aura. Anyone in a short radius around it gets -9 to their melee attack and -10% to their armor-piercing damage. And this can synergize really well with the High Elf line in certain places, being a good debuff aura that the High Elves don't have very many good debuff auras, and this is one of them. So you can also use this guy to tie up units. It's fairly tanky. You can expect it to last out quite a while quite safely. I do kind of like this unit, although it's very expensive, so it's situational as to when you're going to really go for it. But combine this with a High Elven Lord, and you're pretty much going to guarantee dominance of the skies. Sun Dragon is the smallest type of dragon. It's pretty typical for what you expect out of a dragon, but with much lower stats and a slightly lower price point. It's only 200 points cheaper, though, than the Moon Dragon, and the Moon Dragon is quite significantly stronger. And it's a 400 point, which is a pretty big step up to the next level, the Star Dragon. So you would want to sort of consider what you're actually needing these dragons for. If you're just using it for rear charges and stuff like that, the Moon Dragon is actually pretty sufficient. But if you need something that can get into a fight and really mess things up, then the Star Dragon is probably your to-go buddy there. Very, very high stats and probably one of the strongest monsters in the game, especially for a flying type monster. This guy's just got absolutely brutal weapon strength attacks. I've actually been using this guy, like, the Star Dragon's Breath, if it hits a character, deals like 1,000 points of damage. It is ridiculously high damage from this. So if you're flying towards like Malekith or something like that and you hit him with Star Dragon's Breath, it's going to knock out a good chunk of his health. Very, very powerful monster. So again, this is one of those ones that you would use as a highlight of your army if you did take one. Have the rest of your army hold the enemy in place and use the Star Dragon to do most of the line breaking and most of the effective work there. Use the light cavalry or the cavalry to sort of finish off the enemy's archers to stop them from overly harassing your Star Dragon, and use it to sort of pin down and destroy units that are held down by spearmen. That's kind of how the High Elves work. You can either sort of just tear through the enemy infantry with Swordmasters of Hoeth, just go from unit to unit to unit while they're held up by your other units. You can sort of hold them in place for forever with Phoenix Guard while you sort of use missiles to kill the enemy. Or you can use dragon princes to get rear charges, or you can use dragons like the star dragon to just absolutely demolish the enemy wherever they've got a strong point held up against your units. So that's the Hiles in a nutshell. I think that they're actually a really decent army in the position they're in right now. I think that Dark Elves might be just a little bit more versatile, but the High Elven elites really carry the day. There's really nothing that matches up to the Swordmasters of Hoth or the Phoenix Guard in the game there. And while there's certain things that can sort of match the Dragon Princes, they're still probably one of the best cavalry in the game as it currently stands. And they're much more reliable than any of the other high-tier cavalry that other people have got right now. Just in the sense that these guys will, generally speaking, be able to get away from other cavalry units if they need to, with their higher speed than something like, say, Dread Knights or what have you. And they're going to also have that sort of really high sort of resistance to damage that helps them out quite a bit. So those sort of 3 units there, plus potentially the Star Dragon, really is the sort of cornerstone focus of the High Elf army, and you'll sort of win games off the back of those. You can also win just through sheer missile firepower with the High Elves, but it's a little bit harder in terms of the micromanagement, because as excellent as these guys are, they need protection quite badly, and the protection is going to either have to come from those units that I already mentioned, or it's going to have to come from spearmen, and spearmen get rolled over a little bit too quickly if they're sort of not supported by elites. And the thing is, if they're stuck in melee combat, you can't really fire into the combat that easily with your archers, so it does sort of limit your options as far as all that goes. Plus, there's plenty of options in the game right now that can disrupt archers as it stands, either flyers, lots of cavalry for the Dark Elves, or for the Skaven, just the ability to pop clan rats up behind your units, which is really annoying. So anyway, let's get into a battle and check this out and see how things go for the High Elves. Alright, so here we are. We got ourselves a High Elf force here, up against lizardmen in this particular case. I'm going to set up so that we can sort of see along here with our bolt thrower, and hopefully be able to use that as an attack lane for that. Is not necessarily the best map for High Elves in the sense that they do rely quite a bit on their missile potency, but hopefully we'll be able to make something work out here. Yeah, contemplating just having set up on the... Actually, I could set up along here. Yeah, let's set up along here. Yeah, I don't particularly think that these maps are great for High Elves, just because High Elves do tend to rely very heavily on these sort of maps not being too forested. Got ourselves a mage with the chariot. Not necessarily sure that the chariot's that good against the lizardmen, but everything else that I've got here is pretty okay. Oh, god damn it. Okay. Would have been better if I had deployed on the other side, apparently. So we're going to start moving our way across here. So yeah, I should have had the thing pointed the other direction. Okay, what have we got here? Got Lord Mazdamundi, actually, which is quite interesting. A lot of skink cohort source Scar veteran back there. On a Carnosaur or something. A Feral Bastillodon. Stegodon, actually. Source words of shields, skink cohort. So yeah, we're going to try and fire this thing at the back line there, see if we can't get some shots here. It looks like we can fire from there, though, so don't need to move too much more here. And we are going to suffer from the problem of our units cannot really fight too effectively while in the stupid forest here. So we are going to go ahead and move out like this again. Alright. Looks like he's moving into the woods, so okay, well, I mean, if we both just keep trading places, whatever, that's kind of the way that he wants to play it, then that's the way he wants to play it. What I might do is go up here and just start picking away at Lord Mazdamundi with my general. I don't really see any missile units here, so I can probably do this fairly safely, other than the fact that he'll probably cast some spells at me. I can use my own spells, though, as a counter. What's going on here? Alright. So I'm going to try and deal some damage to Mazdamundi here. This laser breath will deal quite a lot of damage to him. Get whatever shots we can on target. Yeah, I kind of figured. He's using arcane, whatever it's called. It's going to put me on a 30-second cooldown, including for that, but it's not going to deal too much damage since I've got a pretty big health pool. So we'll grab our mage here. Alright. So let's go after the Scar veteran, make sure we're going after him with both him and this guy. And we're going to go in against the skin cohort with a quick charge here. Alright. Yeah, so he's just chasing after my archers, which is super annoying, but... Alright. Getting Mazdamuni with this hit. Deal pretty good amount of damage to the bastard. Alright, where is my noble? There he is. Let's try and get into these skinxes from behind here with my dragon. Alright, get a good charge in here if we can. Alright, and let's hit Mazdamundi if we can with this thing, actually. Actually, no, he's all the way over there. I'm not going to be able to do that. Okay. Well, that's fine. Got some breaking across the enemy lines there, which is fine. Dragon is wrecking things up here, which is pretty nice. Kroxigors we should probably try and get in on. Yeah, Mazdamundi using his Geomancy, which is kind of his signature. Oh, let's get out of that. Let's cycle charge. Make sure we're cycle charging when we can. Feral Stegodon, absolutely no match for a dragon. I'm going to try and get up above Mazdamundi, though, here. Another Laser Breath. Alright. I think they already finished killing that guy. Alright, let's get our Dragon Princess, try and finish off a skink cohort.
Princess of Ulthuan, move! I concur! Champion of order.
Don't think I hit there. I guess he's moving too quickly for me.
Ulthuan mage. At once.
Let's try and use this. Actually, let's get Masamune with this guy here. I want to focus him down a bit.
Yes.
Try and fire at these guys here, I think. Alright, we're going to go around and try and attack this skink cohort. They're going to come back into the fight here, it looks like.
Defender of Ulthuan.
Alright, should be able to kill Mazdamundi here. Or if not, come pretty close to it. Fire at them. Phoenix Guard standing here, doing proud. Doing me proud. I should probably heal them up a little bit, though. Actually, that's Hand of Glory. No, we'll do both, actually. Bring their attacks up to, like, 80. Let's actually go into the back of these guys here. Alright. And Mazdamundi is basically screwed at this point in time. Like, he really can't get away from that fight there. So, you know, you gotta bodyguard your general even when it's someone as tough as Mazdamundi if you're up against something like a High Elf Dragon there. I wanted to use Arcane Unmaking on him. It's really good against him, actually, but I guess I didn't really need to. A little bit overkill on a couple of these things here. Alright, so let's take a look at how we did here. Most of my line was doing relatively mediocre. Our Spear Elves did pretty good jobs because they were up against a lot of skink cohort, but the Saurus Warriors with shields are just way too tough for something like a Spear Elf unit. What we got was 78 kills on a unit of Phoenix Guard who barely got scratched, really, and 103 kills on the Dragon Princess. We also got some very key kills with both the Noble and the Princess, so we're able to deal a lot of damage with those sort of key 3 units there. And our main line did okay against the really, really cheap stuff, and we're kind of crumbling against the more elite stuff. Kroxigor and Feral Stegodon were something that I was really quite concerned about, which is, as was the Scar Veteran. All of those things are really good line breakers, and they will take apart Spearmen, even though Spearmen theoretically counter them. This is why the Noble was so important in this particular fight, as well as why I took Phoenix Guard instead of the Sword Masters of Hoeth. I find that a lot of the times you find yourself up against these big monsters with the Lizard Men, which makes the Phoenix Guard a little bit better than the Sword Masters. So anyway, that was a quick look at the High Elves. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.